In the 1990s, I was a postdoc in England, and I subscribed to The Economist magazine. I was a real fan, especially of their science reporting. In 2000, everyone was celebrating the millennium and was thinking ahead to the future. The Economist had an essay competition, asking writers to describe what the world would be like in the year 2050, and to reflect back on the previous half-century's social and economic developments. This is the essay I submitted for that contest. It's a pretty weird essay, and I didn't win. But I think it has some interesting ideas that anticipate some social implications of virtue signaling, ethical investment, and augmented reality. I'll be curious to see what you guys think. Here's the introduction. Information, money, and morality were bound to mix more explosively than could be implied by the feeble-sounding phrase ethical investment. Many of the late 20th century's other apparent oxymorons, like Darwinian feminism or libertarian eugenics, had also progressed, by 2050, through the standard adoption phases of all world morphing forces, from media fad through status symbol to cultural habit. Yet no other trend carried so many others along in its wake. Only when human moral instincts seized control of the global financial markets did the future really start to happen. Millennial enthusiasts for the study of the human genome and the power of the internet usually overlook their true potential to transform a civilization based on conspicuous consumption into one based on conspicuously ethical investment. Catalyzed by religious principles at first, ethical investment quickly became a self-reinforcing cycle, for both financial and social reasons. As capital went ethical, the economic infrastructure of human affluence spread rapidly across the world. This has returned us, in 2050, to much the same position as our hominid ancestors. Nourished by a self-sustaining resource system largely beyond our comprehension, our attention turns from avoiding extinction to directing our future evolution. And the essay itself follows. Against all odds, 21st century ethical investment supplanted 20th century non-ethical consumption as the main way of signaling social status. By the millennium, it was obvious that social and sexual selection had endowed humans with irrepressible instincts for self-display and status-seeking. The urge to send signals was in our blood. Signals about our health, fertility, intelligence, creativity, and moral character. Yet, in those heady first years of evolutionary psychology, it was often forgotten that many possible status signaling systems are consistent with human nature. The zero-sum game of American-style ethics-blind consumerism was neither inevitable nor natural. On the contrary, it required an alienating suppression of sympathy. From our viewpoint now, in 2050, the rise of ethical investment was one of those historical moments when a civilization shifts from one status signaling system to another. Marx got it wrong. The means of display, not the means of production, are crucial in revolutions. The millennial wired generation saw how information technology boosted economic productivity, but failed to see how the whole arena of economic activity would be swallowed by the much more ancient and fundamental arena of socio-sexual display. Other millennial intellectuals had spoken vaguely of a third way between capitalism and socialism. They assumed evolution shaped humans to compete for resources. We can see now that among socially intelligent primates, the competition is fundamentally for the admiration of one's peers, the surest path to successful reproduction. This admiration can depend on resource acquisition ability, as in capitalism, or on moralistic promotion of the common good, as in socialism, but conspicuously ethical investment embraces both. We could call it the true third way, but IQ-boosting drugs have reduced the market for such political rhetoric. The greatest obstacle to the rise of ethical investment lay in the nature of signaling systems themselves. They show strong lock-in effects. Once a signaling convention such as consumerism gets established, it can be very hard for a population to shift to another set of conventions. Throughout the last quarter of the 20th century, ethical investment allowed a few affluent ex-hippies to advertise their environmentalist ideals, but it had minimal impact on business in general. As long as few people invested ethically, there was little incentive to assess or respect the ethicality of other people's investments. Yet, as long as nobody respected ethical investing, there was little personal incentive to invest ethically. In principle, this catch-22 could be solved by rational public discourse, or by a sort of random cultural drift. In practice, though, most ethical revolutions in commerce have been triggered by shifts in religious belief. Whether Victorian Quaker industrialists supporting worker rights, or liberation theology opposing U.S. corporate power in 1980s Central America. In each case, once a sufficient number of people believed that a deity was assessing the ethics of their economic behavior, they had personal incentives to change that behavior, even if other mortals didn't yet give them jobs, housing, or children, as a reward for their newfound ethical status. Perhaps surprisingly, the Catholic Church catalyzed a shift from conspicuous consumption to conspicuously ethical investment. When John Paul II died in 2003, the Vatican elected to the papacy a charismatic, youngish French cardinal who happened to have earned a PhD in international finance from London Business School before being called to the priesthood. His first encyclical of 2005, Felix Culpa, urged all Catholics to renew the tradition of good works, in particular by demanding that their pension funds and mutual funds divest from any producers of armaments, alcohol, tobacco, gambling, pornography, or abortion drugs. Within a few months, 450 million Catholics, controlling about $2 trillion in equity, had followed his advice. Lockheed and Penthouse went into receivership. The Pope also revived the Jesuits as a network of ferociously bright, rapid response ethical analysis teams. Surprise visits by their black Gulfstream 9 jets terrorized exploitative factory managers around the world. By 2011, Catholic executives suspected of unethical commerce could be called before the New Inquisition, which leased the top 8 floors of the World Financial Center in Manhattan. The threat of excommunication, reinforced by a viewing of the Inquisition's IMAX film titled Business Class in Hell, usually puts such managers back on the path of righteousness. Not to be outdone, the major Protestant churches in the U.S. instructed their congregations to bring their investments into line with their consciences. Since 60% of adult Americans still attended church regularly in 2010, most of the remaining $3 trillion in privately held American capital went ethical within a few years. This was followed shortly by the $12 trillion held by institutional investors, ultimately accountable to the church-going individuals whose pensions, mortgages, and bank accounts they held. The result was a flood of capital away from the consumerist highlands of Europe and America to the infrastructure-hungry lowlands of Asia and Africa. Leapfrogging over the dirty technologies of the West, like commuter roads, coal power, pesticides, India and China went straight for subsonic light rail public transport, microgenerator networks, and genetically self-optimizing crops. With such success, more investors went ethical. As they reached a critical mass, their market power forced all other investors to take ethical status into account when predicting each company's share value, even if they personally didn't care about ethics. This led to a virtuous cycle in which investors tried to predict the future ethical priorities of other investors, fueling self-fulfilling prophecies about ever higher corporate ethics. This ethical herding effect was amplified by a new generation of empathogenic drugs that became popular among day traders. These sympathy boosters, with names like Simpatico, Original Position, and Being in the World, were less potent than ecstasy, but gave investors the right mindset to identify and profit from emerging ethical trends. The effects of ethical investment on business management ran deep. Lack of food, clean water, and education ceased to be viewed as problems of international charity, and were seen instead as opportunities for hyper-ethical startups to attract virtuous capital. As in the 1990s, consultants in the 2010s helped corporations turn into e-businesses, but now the E meant ethical rather than electronic. Most companies rebranded their CEOs as Chief Ethics Officers. The fad for hiring professors of moral philosophy as CEOs was short-lived, though. Academics obsessed with the internal consistency of ethical systems were unsuited to judging the protean moral dilemmas of business. William James's pragmatic stewardship of Shell Oil throughout the 2040s was the exception that proved the rule. It generally wasn't worth cloning famous ethicists from the DNA scraps they left around Harvard's library. In the early 2010s, intellectuals worried about the sanctimonious herd mentality of many ethical investors, who often combined religious self-righteousness with a Greenpeace-derived contempt for science, reasoning, and social pluralism. Gradually, though, ethical investment expanded from religious and alternative subcultures into the mainstream. Investors diversified, and so did their ethical criteria. In response, the major ethical ratings firms, names like Eudaimonia, Noblesse Oblige, Magnanimity, and Truth or Dare, adopted a sort of meta-ethical libertarianism. They would discover and provide all the information necessary for anyone to invest according to almost any reasonable ethical system. This created a market niche for, quote, ethical agents, software that could run a person's investment strategy automatically according to pre-specified ethical criteria. Ethical agents proliferated, pandering to even the most bizarre of the fashionable new investor ethics. One's choice of ethical agent became central to one's identity, publicly displayed on lapel pins or tattoos, and subject to as much praise or ridicule as one's choice of spouse or house. A persistent challenge of the 2020s was that the early ethical agents had their share of software bugs and side effects. The most serious led to the non-discounting disaster of 2028. Most ethical agents discounted the welfare of future generations at a rather high rate against the welfare of present generations. Some valued each successive 25-year human generation at only half the preceding one, reflected in discount rates as high as 3% per year. Well, a radical software company called Zero Discount could not find any meta-ethical rationale for this, so it set the discount rate of its ethical agents to 0. Thus, the agents awarded their highest ethical ratings only to companies that promoted ultra-long-term planetary sustainability, even at the expense of future generations. With global media sympathetic to Zero Discount's impeccable logic, 1 billion investors bought its ethical agents to run their investments. As expected, capital fled from heavy polluters into ecotourism and from infertility research into euthanasia centers. Yet billions of dollars also went into an obscure real estate derivatives cult called Ganglion. Ganglion valued long-term insect welfare over short-term vertebrate welfare. This sudden inflow of cash gave Ganglion the resources necessary to engineer, culture, and distribute several tons of a new bioweapon called the spine cutter virus. Within 8 weeks, spine cutter had killed 72% of all humans, 63% of all other mammals, and most birds and reptiles. Ganglion announced a vast dividend for its remaining shareholders, since the value of its highly geared derivatives, technically long puts, soared with the fall in housing demand. The half-life of human civilization also increased 100-fold, according to most simulations. Fortunately for our generation, if not future ones, the non-discounting disaster happened in the virtual testbed economy, where new ethical agents were required to spend a simulated decade of trading before release into the real world. We weren't that dumb even back in 28. Not a single real life was lost, but the disaster provoked much soul-searching among people who questioned their presentist and vertebrocentric biases. Ethical investment raised another challenge. The complexities of corporate cross-ownership, supply chain relationships, and service outsourcing made it difficult to award ethical scores to the largest holding companies and corporations. The ethical ratings agencies realized as long ago as 2010 that corporate behavior could be improved not only by ostracizing companies that misbehave, but also by ostracizing those that do business with those that misbehave. As in human societies, this could encourage mutual policing. However, while no multinational was ethically spotless in its business connections, few were deliberately evil, and the shades of gray were hard to quantify. Some MIT econometricians found a solution in 2015 with their ethical backpropagation algorithm. Given enough information and well-specified ethical criteria, ethical backprop could assess the impact of any particular business practice on people, animals, and environments, and could pass or propagate credit or blame back along the supply chain to providers of any materials, services, personnel, or capital supportive of the practice. If a fireworks company were found to be producing black market landmines, not only would the company be seriously downgraded by the ratings agencies, but all of its associated suppliers, distributors, banks, law firms, temp agencies, and even office cleaning agencies would be downgraded as well. By quantifying the moral principle of guilt by association, ethical backprop allowed individual investors to trade on this information. This locked companies together into virtuous cycles, with good behavior maintained by the threat of mutually harmful ethical downgrades. One of ethical backprop's more surprising effects was the way it reduced the power of nation-states. It represented national governments as just another set of service providers that could be ethically rated, an idea that U.S. citizens found especially hard to accept when the ethical raters were foreign. In 2029, the Bangalore-based Truth or Dare agency threatened to ethically downgrade the United States, including its government bonds, for corruption and war crimes, if the U.S. did not prohibit corporate donations to political campaigns and, number two, the support of armaments manufacturers through the maintenance of its overseas military bases. Both of these were core features of American culture, for better or worse, but the first one violated the World Bank's new directives on consumer rights in relation to government service providers, and the second one violated the United Nations monopoly on the legitimate use of force in international relations. The U.S. scoffed at Truth or Dare, which retaliated by awarding it at noon GMT on January 17, 2031, a CCC rating. Institutional investors reacted instantly. Global pension funds, investment banks, and mutual funds issued sell orders on all their American holdings to avoid ethical backprop's guilt by association rules. There were almost no buyers, except for a few ethically contrarian traders living in their orbital tax havens. American equities went into free fall and lost half their value by 12:21 p.m. Also, since ethical backprop viewed national currency as just another product associated with government service providers, it penalized any institution that traded using U.S. dollars or dollar-denominated instruments. Within a few hours of Truth or Dare's downgrade, the dollar lost 87% of its value against ethically hard currencies, and the U.S. government could no longer service its international debt. Of course, global telecommunications providers also felt obligated, on behalf of their ethical shareholders, to shut off almost all information traffic to and from the U.S. Suddenly, poor, deaf, and blind, the U.S. government capitulated to Truth or Dare's requests at 4:13 p.m. GMT, starting with the closing of overseas Army, Navy, and Air Force bases. The UN organized a standard peacekeeping force to protect the ethically challenged regime from further humiliation. The power of ethical investment finally started to sink in, even among the die-hard consumerists of North America. Over the last few years, ethical investment has become ever more conspicuous. The moral vision system has been widely adopted by affluent youth, despite the cranial surgery required to install the in-skull telecomputers. Each moral vision unit maintains radio contact with the Global Virtue Database, which keeps public records of everyone's facial appearance and their investments. By tapping into the optic nerves directly, moral vision can recognize everyone visible to the user and display virtual symbols above their heads to represent their investment holdings. Symbol size indicates overall wealth. Shape, color, and texture reveal the ethical priorities and investment philosophies. Ordinary working folks typically have small white halos, showing sub-million holdings in B-rated semi-ethicals. Educated professionals usually attain frisbee-sized gold halos by their mid-50s, revealing a few $1 million in pro-social pensions. Virtual hats are more popular than halos, though. Neo-Kantians favor virtual bowlers, preferably 2 sizes too small, to symbolize the investment discipline required by the categorical imperative. At the other extreme, act utilitarians wear filigreed Klein bottles on their heads to emphasize the intricate textures and topological complexities of moral dilemmas. Hobbesian contractarians settled on sombreros, but they are always getting called humanists and other derisive terms by the gay-eccentrics and radical biophilics who wear fern-colored cowls. A few defiantly psychopathic billionaires display vast black zeppelins above their heads, advertising serious equity in casinos or chemical weapons factories. The privacy freaks and grizzled opt-outs who refuse to disclose the ethicality of their holdings are shown with red devil horns, guaranteeing their exclusion from the job, housing, and mating markets. Physically, most adults go bald now, since hair interferes with the virtual symbols that everyone else with moral vision can see anyway, and which are the truer representations of one's success, character, and taste. The head-shaving ceremony on the 16th birthday, when one gains the right to invest, has become the most significant ritual in life. Octogenarian trillionaires like Gates and Ellison squander vast sums commissioning ethical investment philosophies, i.e. virtual hat designs, from the Guild of Virtual Milliners. In response, some retro Puritan students, who style themselves Veblen's avatars, have protested this conflation of conspicuous consumption, which they consider bad, with conspicuously ethical investment, which everyone agrees is good. It is hard to recall the literal moral blindness that afflicted the 20th century before moral vision gave us a window into each other's souls. To a millennial pessimist, our present year of 2050 would seem incomprehensibly utopian in many regards, while retaining all the social, sexual, ethnic, and intergenerational tensions characteristic of human nature. The infrastructure needed to deliver food, water, clothing, and shelter to the 12 billion humans on Earth is not only universally available, but almost entirely automated. Likewise for the technologies of communication, entertainment, and even investing itself. The ecosystems are safe. If anything, we are overcapitalized. From an evolutionary viewpoint, though, luxuriant overinvestment in ourselves is nothing new. Mammals prospered by gorging their young on milk. Hominids gorged each other on meat and gossip. Most of the matter, time, and ambition that used to be sucked into the black hole of conspicuous consumption is now invested in each other and into our future. With the global economy and ecosystems prosperous, stable, and resilient, our challenges are not so urgent as the nuclear threat or global warming of the 20th century. We have time to step back and consider our long-term options. What kind of people, animals, and plants should there be? Are we sufficiently responsible to colonize space yet, or should we wait a few thousand years first? It may take a few more generations to shift our cultural mindset from reactive crisis management to proactive prioritizing. In learning this new skill, ethical investment has given us our best practice.